Today, we dive deep with Ted Forbes, the mind behind decades of podcasts and YouTube videos on the art of photography, and now his new book, Visual Storytelling. We talk about the art, the theory, the untold truths that make images truly unforgettable. So let's get started.
This week on the show, we are delighted to be joined by Ted Forbes. Now, Ted is a photographic educator who has been basically putting out absolute gold on YouTube for, years now. Years. I remember watching some of your videos back in the day, Ted, and they're just amazing. And when we told some of our patrons that we were having you on, we got lots of thumbs up, legend, lots of nice comments.
Wow.
So,
Thank you.
We're really excited to have you on the show this week, and we're obviously bringing you on primarily to kind of talk about a new book that you have coming out, but also because what I've always loved about what you do with your YouTube show is really delve into photography in a way that not many, you don't see that many people doing it, kind of analyzing the visual language. So in order for us to kind of get to that point, can you just, and for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with you, which I don't think will be anyone, would you mind giving us a bit of a background? Like, what was your photographic journey? How did you get to where you are now? And because photographers always have these circuitous kind of routes into the industry. No one way is the way that it happens, you know, and yours
Actually, I like that you're saying that. Yeah. It's, I think for anybody, it used to be that, I think generations ago, like my dad's generation, for instance, you kind of pick one path and then you go through life and you're able to do that. And I don't remember where I read this, but I think the statistics say that the average person changes careers 5 times now, not just jobs, careers, So I think that, that idea of being flexible, and everybody's photographic journey is different. Now, photography is very different than a career because it's something that we're very deeply passionate about, something that we just have a calling to. It's very, as you guys know, it's very difficult to make a living as a photographer now. And I have utmost respect for those that are able to manage that. But yeah, so my journey was very different. I got my first camera when I was 10 years old. My parents gave me a little Kodak 110 for my birthday, the little slim thing, and you put the little cartridge in. And I had a lot of fun with that. And photography ever since has always been something that is just part of who I am and what I do. Even though when I was in high school, I didn't take it that seriously. I was really into music. I wanted to be the next Jimi Hendrix. So I was playing guitar all the time. And that was where I came from there. And then when I went on to college, I studied music formally and got my degree in music. And my goal was that I wanted to do film scoring. And I realized that after I graduated, what that would entail was me moving to Los Angeles and starving for another 10 years at least, ghostwriting for people. And that did not appeal to me at all. And at that time, Napster had come out and the music industry was radically changing. And so I realized the writing was on the wall and I was going to have to figure out what I was going to do for a living. And music could be mine on the side. And I really got burnt out on it at the time. I think it really devastated me that it was just such a definition of who I was. And all of a sudden, this photography thing came back to me. And I'd never stopped shooting. I just wasn't doing it very seriously or with any kind of consistency. But I started doing it again because it was something that was mine. And many jobs and careers later, the bottom line, I'm skipping a whole bunch because it's real boring. But YouTube had come along, and actually it was before YouTube because my show started as a podcast on iTunes, and this was 16 years ago. So this was 2008. Wow. And I realized at the time that all of a sudden here's a platform, and this was very interesting to me. And so at the time I was working at an art museum, and the idea of episodic content they were very interested in, and they asked if I had any experience with it. And I thought, well, sure I do, and I didn't. And so what I wanted was a little project I could do on the side where I could make video and I could do episodic content consistently, post everything. And I was going to do 10 of these and stop. That was the extent of the project. And I got through the first 2 or 3 and I didn't have a massive audience or anything, but I remember getting an email from somebody in the UK and they said, hey, I saw your video on whatever it was. And I think it was pinhole photography. And they said, well, I'm really into that too, blah, blah, blah. And that just opened this door for me because it was really exciting to see that you could connect really with anybody in the world, which is, normal today, especially post-COVID. that, all of a sudden I'm having these conversations, and I just kept doing it because I enjoyed it. And pretty soon YouTube started to mature. And I thought, well, there's another outlet for my videos. So I posted on both platforms for a long time. And then YouTube just kind of took off. And podcasting, that was the first wave of podcasting in that era, where it was audio, but then it was also video podcasts. And video kind of went away for that medium and stuck with audio. And then so YouTube just became my thing. And then I took it from there. And, as a result, I kind of have this dream job where, I am able to, when I did the artist series, I just chose my favorite photographers, Keith Carter and Graciela Urtubide and, all these people. And so being able to kind of learn from some of those people was just amazing to me. I met Ralph Gibson that way, and I actually have formally studied with Ralph at this point. And anyway, so that's been kind of my journey. It's been very unconventional, I think, in terms of, how I got here. But that's essentially what happened.
I think that thing of
sorry about that.
No. That's great. I mean, I love the fact that you spent time working in an art museum. There's one of my favorite photographers is a photographer called Jason Eskenazi, and he had a similar thing. I think he worked at the MoMA, maybe, when there was maybe it wasn't the MoMA, but there was the exhibition on to do with Robert Frank. And he kind of lived with that exhibition, I believe, for a long time whilst he was on, and would obviously get to visit it every day because he worked there as a security guard, I think. And
that's the amazing thing about working in a museum, is that you do have that opportunity. And when I took that job, and to be clear about what I did there, I mean, I was a multimedia producer, which basically meant any kind of media that needed to be produced, whether it was video, sometimes it was a website, something like that. But I got to work with curators, I got to work with educators, in the ideas that they wanted to get out to the public too. But the most amazing thing for me, like what you just said, is that and the Dallas Museum of Art did not have a huge photography collection, but they did have some stuff. And I remember one day they were hanging this black and white exhibition, and right outside of my office is this Robert Mapplethorpe picture that Tom Burrell had printed. And it was just like, oh my God, it's so wild. And Ansel Adams and, all this other stuff. But being able to live with art that consistently, I worked there for 7 years. And it's just kind of, I think I never wanted that to get old. It's like just being able to walk through a gallery on your way to lunch and see something. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, because there was some, especially when you get into like contemporary painters and stuff, that was just beyond my experience. And so I was sort of familiar with Jackson Pollock, but I didn't know who Gerhard Richter was. And I remember the first time I saw those paintings, I thought, these are photographs, and they're amazing photographs, right? No, they're paintings. I mean, he paints the depth of field and the blurry parts of the image, but he's also a photographer. And so a lot of those experiences, I mean, I can't deny they definitely shaped how I think about photography. And even I remember there was a curator when I first started. She went on to become the director at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Her name was Dorothy Kaczynski. And I remember watching her do gallery talks with visitors, it'd be around lunchtime, and she'd take people into galleries and give a little tour of whatever was going on. And she was just incredibly gifted at being able to speak in a way that it taught you the art history about it and what the intention of the artist was, but in this very entertaining way. And she just had everybody in the palm of her hand. I remember watching her and thinking that's what I wanted to do when I started my YouTube channel. I wanted to have that type of delivery that was interesting and engaging, and people, it was inspiring to people. You want to go make something when you're done, that kind of thing. So
I guess the genesis of this book, then, the Visually Speaking book that you're bringing out, is effectively amalgamating a lot of those lessons from your YouTube channel over years of putting that stuff out there. So how then is it different? I mean, for people who aren't familiar with your channel, how is it different from other photography books? And that's what I've seen of it, has really piqued my interest, because so many, in some ways, much like our podcast, there's a lot of podcasts out there about photography that are really good, and they speak to specific photographers. And I think the way that we've tried to approach it with our podcast is to actually have two working photographers who kind of approach it as photographers wanting to learn about how other people do their business. There's a lot more on the business side, I feel, but it's also looking at different aspects maybe than if you get with just a singular kind of character each week. So what is your book kind of, from what I've seen, it's not just a kind of a series of images. It's really kind of being analytical about those images and why images work, why images don't work, how composition kind of flows, and what you should be thinking about. It's really starting to make is it trying to kind of make people just speak a visual language or understand a visual language better?
Absolutely. The impetus for the book really goes back to when I started the podcast. And that's why I'm glad you asked the first question, because of my music background. When I was studying music, in music, you have music theory that goes along with it. And it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, whereas photography is only 200 years old. And it's when I was studying music, you learn the theory behind it. I majored in composition at one point, and Western music is built on a chromatic scale of 12 notes. You have a diatonic scale that goes within that. It can be transposed to any of the 12. You have rhythms, you have harmony, you have, there's a language and a syntax that's very formally analyzed. Well, I'm just saying that there's an incredible amount of music theory behind it. Now, there are musicians that don't know any of that are incredible, and that happens. But even then they internalize and they understand how to speak musically, even if they don't know the bits and pieces of what it is that they're doing. And the truth is, and this happens in photography too, you can overanalyze to where you're creating images that don't have any character or soul and so, it was done. You're asking kind of two questions in there, because it was done to be very different by design. I have collected tons of books over the years, and that's just a pinch of them, and, one of the frustrations I had is that for me, especially back in like the 1950s, you would see these books that were written that would be, this encyclopedic, approach to photography. And they would talk about how to develop your film and how to even make your developers. And they would talk about the exposure triangle, even though they didn't call it that. They'd talk about how to use filters. They'd talk about cameras. They'd talk about everything, lighting, everything except what it goes into making an actual image that resonates with somebody. And so this always was very interesting to me, and it was very frustrating when it came from music, because I wanted to know that there was this visual theory that went along with everything, and there's really not. I mean, there sort of is, but it's in a very different, less specific way than music theory is. And so when I started doing the YouTube channel, I realized pretty early on that there's a way that I can look at things and explain things that ultimately, when we get to the book here, end up being a bit of a language, so to speak. And so what it is, break it down to the essence, what is a photograph doing? It's communicating to the viewer something. And maybe there could be a wide range of things. It can make somebody excited about something. It can make them fall in love. It can make them be happy. It can be depressing. It can be shocking. It can be something awful even. And those all have different intentions, but they are communicated. So how do we communicate through images? And it comes down to a variety of things. It comes down to lights and shadows. It comes down to geometry. It comes down to composition. It comes down to subject, all these various things. And so the book really is an analytical way of breaking all of that down into a system that people can start to understand. The other thing that's very specific about photography is because it's just a moment in time that's frozen. There's no motion in photography. There's no time. And so, all of a sudden you're broken away from reality there. And it becomes very interesting. So how do we communicate through that? And anyway, all those things have always been fascinating to me. And so kind of coming up with what is that language and how do we understand that? And I realized that was really going to be the impetus for that book, mainly because it was something that I hadn't seen anywhere. And that's not to say that there aren't great photography books. There's a lot of, it's all over the map. They're really good books. There are also, a lot of the sameness to it. Like, for instance, Ansel Adams wrote that book on the zone system, which is very popular. So if you shoot film and you shoot black and white, in many ways, if you want to understand contrast, he and Fred Archer really defined that language. And after that, there were so many knockoffs of the zone system. A lot of Ansel's students rewrote that book. Some of them are actually better than the original, because Ansel's is pretty hard to understand sometimes. But there just seems to be a follow the leader thing. And, I don't, while doing a portfolio book would be fun one day, I don't really know that, like, for instance, the portfolio books that I own, in other words, just a catalog of somebody's images, they really only speak to me if I'm interested in their work, right? And so I figured I could hit a broader audience as an educator and as a photographer if I talked about that system that I think about of how images work. So that's where the whole idea of the book came from.
I think, it seems like we live in a world that's absolutely saturated with images. There's never been more images being created every single day. There are so many platforms for it. And yet it almost feels as though there's a visual illiteracy that goes with it, or a sense of, groupthink, especially when you see kind of images on social media that have a certain kind of look that people say, oh, that's a great image, and it's almost kind of a generic, it's a very, I don't want to say like basic understanding, but there is a kind of core base of like, right, that's a great shot of a sunset, whatever, versus something that is elevated that maybe people don't not necessarily not understand, but it's maybe a more complex image. And I wonder if we've kind of also going through this stage, and this is only just really coming to me, but we were surrounded by visual images, but actually increasingly we're now surrounded by video clips. And so it's almost like we went through this period where there were millions of images out there being created and put online, and now it's like actually the peak has been hit, and now it's kind of actually it's more about video. So in a sense, even more so, the idea of the visual literacy in the still image is perhaps is more necessary than ever, but it's also it's on the dip, maybe. I don't know.
Ready for it to trend back. Well, I mean, I agree completely with what you're saying, and I address a little bit of that towards the end of the book, because when you look at something like, well, if you look at how many photographs we're bombarded with a day, it's not just social media. It's billboards, it's magazines that you might flip through. There are images literally everywhere. And, there's a big difference between doing something that stands out versus not. But I think in that same context, if we look at social media and you look at something like Instagram per se, that has started to flip more towards video. Instagram, their end goal is not to show you video necessarily or stills, it's to capture your attention. So whatever's going to hold that is what's important. And what you're going to see on there, and I think that when Instagram was new, it was very different. And one of the most beautiful things about it, I thought, is when I would see, back when it kind of started and your only friends and people you followed were friends and family, right? Mm-hmm. And I would see my cousins who are not photographers, for instance, they would post what's going on in their lives. And all of a sudden, compared to like blogging, where people are writing up, even on Facebook, they write reams of stuff that maybe I'm interested, maybe I'm not. They're forced to communicate with a photograph because Instagram's really not about the text. And I like that. I love that idea. Now, the way it manifests itself is whatever. I mean, now they just show me suggested stuff. And I went to Japan a couple of weeks ago, so my entire feed is geisha and temples. And it's like, God, I'm in the algorithm. This is just awful. And that's what an algorithm can't do, is figure out when you're tired of it.
Yeah.
Or those of us that have complex tastes, I guess. But, that's what it is. And there's a way to stand out. And I think some of it has to do with the context of it, too. Because let's say you have something really, and you see this on Instagram. How many times have you seen, like, I remember the first time I found Elliot Erwitt on Instagram, and he had like 100 followers. And it was like, are you kidding me? This is like one of the greatest photographers that's still living. And this is his sub count. Or Ralph Gibson's the same thing. But those guys don't play the game, right? They don't get in there and post 6 times a day and do videos. And so much of that content, when you get into the influencer world, becomes a look at me kind of approach. Here's my day. Sure. Here's my routine. Here's what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And that does speak to a certain level of people, and it connects with an audience. But I think most of us and most of those people watching your show are going to be more in the camp of we have something that we want to say that goes beyond that, hopefully. In fact, most of what I say doesn't have much to do with my daily routine at all. So it's a lot of it's the context, and Instagram just isn't the place for photography at the moment. Now, the other thing that I think is difficult about photography, and I don't know whether you guys would concur with this or not, but particularly when we get into genres like, let's say, street photography, it is so difficult. It's one genre, like personally, I have so much difficulty with, and I don't try to go at it as street photography because of the 1950s and the 1960s. There's so many iconic images. The world looked different then. There weren't advertisements everywhere and billboards, logos on everything. Cars looked different. People dressed different. They didn't wear shorts. They wore suits to, like professional sports games. So it's just a different time, and it has a different look. And it's also, there's been so many photographers who've had things to say in that genre that today it becomes increasingly more difficult to have anything new to add to it. It's not to say somebody won't do it, but it's just the bar is so high there. And I think that a lot of forms of photography are like that. But, it's interesting, too. I remember I was talking to Ralph Gibson about this once, and I said, I think, that frustrates myself and a lot of photographers. It's like, what do you do to kind of break out of that? And he said, this is nothing new. He said, within the first year, let's say the daguerreotype recipe goes out around the world and people have access to this new thing called photography. Every genre think about this, had been already explored within probably the first year or two of photography. That included landscape photography, street photography, portraits, wildlife, you name it. It had probably already been done. So it's not a matter of what's been done. It's a matter of what one is going to do with it. And I hope that what you're saying is correct, that the idea of the still image would be kind of on the resurgence. I doubt you'd see it in social media, just because social media is designed to capture one's attention.
Yeah.
And if video is doing that more than stills, then that's what they're going to promote. And I think that's where it is right now. Now, that doesn't say that the power of the still image could come back and all of a sudden people are saying something that is more resonating, or I don't know. I just don't know what that looks like, because it when you get into social media and algorithms and that whole business model for Zuckerberg and all those guys, what they're doing, it's above my level of comprehension to understand how they calculate that and what it is they're looking for. But I can guarantee you, Facebook's business is in its best interest, not photographers. So it's that context.
Do you know what, you say that? There's been reports over the past week or two that they are releasing AI profiles onto both Instagram and Facebook, right?
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah, yesterday.
Yeah, you saw that, and you kind of go, how can that be?
Who wants to live in that world? I mean,
I'm out. No chance.
Well, but actually, I think saying that right now is also indicative of, for instance, AI. I don't think it's found its place yet. It like replacing skies, or I don't have a need for that. Removing people from the scene, who cares? I'm a photographer. I try to shoot with more of a decisive moment than wrong things being in the picture. But the whole idea of AI, because I know a lot of, like with my audience, a lot of photographers feel threatened by that, like it's going to replace us somehow. But in the end, and this goes back to visual communication, you have an emotional connection that I think you're trying to make on some level with the viewer, and AI is the whole basis is training on models of what's been done before. So AI being forward thinking is going to be maybe another thing entirely. So I don't believe that it's totally going to take over. And like I said, who wants to live in that? I mean, if I know it's following, you can tell AI images right now, at least. There's something creepy about them, and it's something that's just so stale. And
teeth are off, or the nose is wrong, or the fingers there's extra.
17
and all that.
hands.
Skin's plastic. Yeah, it's just weird,
Yeah. Did you see the Coca-Cola advert at Christmas?
No. Oh no.
Okay.
Did they do a full AI?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. It's
good luck to them. I mean, I don't see how. I know the appeal, especially for an ad agency, and you guys would know this. I mean, is that it's cheaper and it's faster. I don't have to wait and pay a photographer a bunch of money to go do something. And so their bottom line is that. But really, their bigger bottom line is it's going to be, does that result in sales or brand awareness, or
exactly, how effective is it?
Yeah, and for any commercial photographer who's really good at it, that's their thing. So.
I want to just briefly bring it back to the kind of what people can expect to find in the book in terms of subject matters that you cover, because I'm interested to delve a little bit more into that and try and see if today we could give our audience some kind of takeaways. Sure. So what are the topics that you cover throughout the book? If you think of kind of like chapter headings, what's the kind of
everything? I mean, from at least just approaching photography perspective. And there was a point, because that book, I worked on it for 2 years. It probably took a year to do the text. It was supposed to be done in 3 months, but that didn't happen. But there was a point where, thank you. Sorry, my assistant is handing me things off camera here in a subtle way, in case I don't remember what I wrote, which I don't. But to get back to your question, it became frustrating because there's a lot of things in there that really could be an entire book unto themselves. And I'm trying to keep it into a chapter, if you will. So it definitely, I mean, I think in one point, it gave me a jumping off point to where I could, there's other topics I could expand on later. But, if we compare photography to a language, and right now we're speaking in English, and we've all spoken it our entire lives. And so we understand it pretty well. And you could break down what I'm speaking, and you could say, there's a subject and a verb, and there's a predicate, and there's adjectives, and there's, you go through the syntax. Am I thinking about those things while I'm talking to you guys? No, I'm not. And why? Because I've internalized it. I know the words, and you don't have to think about it. And then that opens your mind to actually communicate something. Like, you're asking me questions. So you're not thinking about syntax. And I'm giving you answers, hopefully. and not getting too tied up on that. And so I think that a lot of like, what are those building blocks, if we use that metaphor of a language, that we can speak to that. And, you know, it's interesting because I was trying to think of the earliest example. So, I mean, the book literally starts with cave drawings and there's a debate in anthropology is at what point did humans become self-aware that they were expressing something? I'm no anthropologist, but my feeling is they were doing it on any of the examples that you see that go back literally tens of thousands of years. Those are the only ones that survive. They were in caves, so they were protected from the environment and weather. There may have been other examples we just don't know about, but you know, a lot of times you see obviously the little pictograms of cattle or whatever it is, or herds, or then you see the bows. So you know they were hunting and they're telling you something. But the most amazing thing to me is even in those earliest examples that there's a handprint that they do they blow paint or at least powder around, so they leave an imprint of their hand. They're signing their work essentially. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is those caves are really dark, so the fact that you would go in there with paint ready or pigment and the blowing device or whatever it is shows that they're
intention
determined they were going to do that. So, but yeah, we start there and then we start moving up, and then, you know, you go through everything from geometry to we could talk about lighting. We could talk about the whole idea, you know, Cartier-Bresson branded it so beautifully as the decisive moment, but that is true. If you're photographing anything from a documentary standpoint, you're waiting for that point. And so you being a photographer, your brain has to be aware of what's happening in the picture. I mean, you're responsible for every square inch in that entire shot, right? And so if there's anything in there that doesn't belong, it's going to detract from the picture. And so a lot of that is understanding and being, I loved it in the decisive moment, actually, in the forward, Bresson talks about his hunting skills that he used in photography. And a lot of that is knowing how to wait for something, knowing how, understanding what it's going to do. And those are things that are very difficult. I think for me, I'm sidetracking a little bit, but like the things that's difficult about photography is that it's a medium that is collaborative. So what I mean by that is that you have a lot of control over what's happening, but you also have to collaborate with the way things are going to happen. Now, in a studio situation where you have control over the lighting and everything, that's a lot different. But if you're shooting street photography, for example, or if you're shooting wildlife, or, you know, you're collaborating with your subject in a sense. And a lot of people, and I'm one of those people, it's difficult because I all of a sudden start seeing possibilities, and I want a dancing monkey with a circus thing. You know, it is not going to happen, right? Or I want somebody to turn and look at me a certain way, or you know, you can't rely on that. You have to be able to anticipate what's going to happen. So I talk a little bit about that in there too. But really, what it is for any photographer, no matter what you do, in terms of the genre that you produce work in, or maybe you work commercially, but being able to understand these things. Color is another thing. Being able to understand black and white. Those to me are two different languages. Color, again, you don't have ultimate control over, but you can start to look for patterns of things that are complementary to one another, or analogous or contradictory. Black and white was, you know, back when I shot film all the time, I was such a black and white nerd because I learned how to develop, and I was so into Ansel Adams and later John Blakemore, and being able to control what was going on, which is really important. I mean, when you have a black and white image, is how your contrast is shown or displayed or rendered is really important to the effect of the final image. If it has weak contrast, it's not as appealing to look at. If it's too much contrast, sometimes that's difficult too. So, you know, all these things contribute to that language, and kind of trying to break them down in a way where photographers can at least start thinking about these things and practicing these things. That's another issue that I talk about a lot in the book, is that it always I always found it very strange that when I was in music, especially when I was in college and everybody's really serious about getting better, like in the afternoons, you don't see anybody, or the evenings sometimes, because everybody's off practicing. They're in working on their instrument, whatever that is. And when I got to photography, photographers don't practice. They just go do all the time. And I always thought that was just interesting. I mean, it's a medium that sure, you can do that. Anybody can press a button and make an image, right? So it's not that difficult. But one of my first mentors when I started getting serious about it was a family friend. He's talked about in the book a lot. And one thing that Greg used to do, and this was back pre-digital, but he always said, go out in your backyard and practice. And what he meant was learn how to see. Don't even put film in your camera. Just get used to like framing up compositions, looking at little things, see how shapes relate to one another. And your backyard's very difficult to shoot in because you see it all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So go out there and later on, I remember Keith Carter saying, you want a real challenge, go make 12 images all within 100 feet of your house. It's very difficult because you're so used to seeing it. But other things too, this was also pre-autofocus, but Greg was like, try to get in focus, use the focus screen, practice all those things. So then when you do have film in your camera, you're ready to roll. Mm-hmm. And it's always been something that has been important to me. And I try, even like right now, it's starting to get really cold and we're supposed to have snow this week, which is weird for Texas, but it makes it very unappealing to try to shoot anything. Mm. Well, what can you do? I can do still lifes here in the house. I can, when the snow hits, I can do that. There are things, but trying to, even on days where I really don't feel like forcing a shot within 100 feet from my house, I try to do it anyway, just because it's that practice. And what it is it's understanding how to learn how to see visual elements, learn how to create interest. I remember Ralph Gibson telling me, even great photographers, how many great photographs do they really take and how often do they don't do them every day, right? So you've got to, between your two great photographs, you've got to fill the time getting ready for the next. Mm-hmm. And, his point is that if I'm a good photographer, right, I should be able to take this chair that's next to me and do something interesting with that. Why not? Because you're a good photographer, right? You should be able to do it. So why not practice that and do that on a regular basis? And some people do and others don't, but it's something that I think should be very conscious, and that whole idea of practicing and understanding that. And the other thing I talk about in the book too that I think is very important, that was really important for me, it was a big turning point for me, is that I used to be the kind of photographer who I would go make a bunch of images and then they were taken. I'd put them into Lightroom or whatever, get them on the hard drive, and I'm ready for the next ones. I might look at them that night, but I really don't revisit afterwards. And as a result, I wasn't really seeing improvement in results in my own work. And I remember when I started studying with Ralph, that was one thing he told me, is he said, you've got to understand your relationship with your own work. You're not analyzing it. You're not looking at it. You're not using that as a point of what could I have done differently, what worked, what didn't work, and having that relationship with it. And when I started to do that, and he took me through a few exercises where we would take an image that I'd made that was close, and just by recropping it a little bit, you could kind of fix it. And I said, okay, I'm starting to understand this. And then he would look at what I was doing, and he said, okay, Theodore, you obviously get this. You need to learn how to do it in camera. It's going to save you a bunch of time. So that was something that all of a sudden I'm starting to be conscious of and aware of and thinking about. But because I had that relationship with my older work, and believe me, some of it was terrible. And there was no reason to go look at it a second time, but forcing myself into that and understanding why, let's not say good or bad because those are opinions, but what it was that I didn't like about it and why it was bothersome to me, right? So those are things you can start to fix, and those are things that you can start to project forward into something new that you haven't done before. And so, and that's something that I think a lot of photographers do. We're kind of in this world. I think any artist is, even a painter or sculptor. You're on to your next project. That's what's exciting, right? But you have to understand those things that came before you, and you have to have a relationship with it. The reality is when any well-known photographer does an exhibition, whether it's a gallery or museum, it's all old work, right? Rarely are they showing. They might be showing an exhibition of recent things they've worked on, but it's still in the past. They're not showing the stuff they haven't taken yet, obviously. So,
yeah, I think it's.
I went a long way around telling you what's in this book, but all those things are, and I do talk about them in there.
Okay, so if we were to kind of distill it down even further, though, to say, give us three points that people could think about when it comes to composition. Just three little takeaways. Because I watched your fantastic, we'll link to it in the show notes, but you did a really good episode on composition where you brought in your little black dots and you kind of pushed them around and really talked through compositional theory.
It's funny. Some people, I took a design course, and my teacher, Lori Collins, taught that. And we had to do that, and we had to glue them on, and we had to make thousand, well, not a thousand. We had to make a bunch of them though. And it went on for 2 weeks and everybody's just like, ugh. And then finally you start to realize what it is that you're doing. And so I wasn't sure how that exercise was going to go down with people when I did that video. But it did resonate with a lot of people more than it didn't, which was very surprising to me and also exciting because, hey, all right, there's something here that I'm communicating and people are understanding. But so 3 takeaways I would do is one, you get into composition and then everybody, again, here's where the sameness in a lot of books comes out. They all teach the same thing. Rule of thirds, right? And I have to put these in the book because I can't ignore them. But there's rule of thirds, there's rule of odds, there's, those things. They're mathematical, visual, not mathematical as much. I think especially like rule of thirds, essentially rule of thirds. The idea of rule of thirds is just to get you off the center of the image. You can have something, your subject dead center in the image if there's some kind of effect that you want. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it can be more, you can create more interest if it's off the center. So things like rule of thirds and all tend to address that really quickly. So that's the first thing is I would just go learn those. The other thing is people think that because they're called rules is that they must be followed. That's not the case. They're guidelines of what works. And you can choose to try to do something different. And there's usually a reason why. You could choose to follow them, and there would be a reason why. Cartier-Bresson stuck very firmly within classical composition rules. And so you can see all of those, whether it's the Fibonacci spiral or whatever. But I wouldn't stick too close to those because then you're doing paint by numbers if you're photographing that way. So the second thing that I would do is just you start to understand proximity. And this is discussed in the book. There's a whole chapter on it. When you have things in the frame and what is their relationship to one another, and that usually is their distance. And so you were talking about the exercise where you have the little dots, right? So are they clustered? Is one removed? That's just something completely different. And I know we're just talking about little dots on a page, but if you have 3 little shapes that have all this negative space around them, having them close together implies that they are related. There's a relationship and in the greater context because you're using negative space to do that. If you bring one of them out, it creates tension and it brings that energy level up a little bit. What's effective and what's correct for the composition, that's going to be up to you as the photographer, but understanding what those possibilities are. Sometimes if they're just randomly placed, it's harder to note. But another thing that I say in that is that understanding the relationships, not only to one objects within the image, but their relationship to that frame of the image, whether it's landscape or whether it's portrait. The edges are so important in a composition. It's what defines the composition. If they weren't there, you don't have a composition. You just have stuff.
And to frame is to exclude, so you have to bear that in mind of what you're showing, but also what you're not showing.
Absolutely.
To jump on that point, that's what I find fascinating about really good street photography and why I've got so much respect for it as a medium within the photography genre, is that all of these ideas have to be totally intuitive because you need to be responding to something on an emotional level without analytically thinking, this photo is going to work because that person is over there and that person's over there and there's a tension built up and the gaze is, taking your eye into this point and that point. You've got to have all of that in a split-second reaction. Yes. Whereas, say, if you're doing something in a studio, there's a lot more control over it.
Absolutely. No, you're 100% correct. It happens quickly. That comes back to my point, is understanding the syntax and being able to internalize it to where you're not thinking about it. That's the most important thing. You want to learn the language so you can forget thinking about it and you just speak. The same thing with photography. And you're right. Especially, I think street photography is the quintessential example of that because it happens so fast. And you've got to understand, like, you can't be thinking about, depth of field. And, you've got to be able to anticipate a lot of those things.
You need to be in the zone really with it. That's in terms of creative flow. And I think that's also what can make it so discouraging for people is you can go out and you can spend 4 or 5 hours walking around, but you might never get into that zone mentally to actually be picking up on what you're seeing. And I think
absolutely
possibly,
and things happen. I mean, one of the great metaphors is, I remember seeing this video with Joel Meyerowitz, and he was saying that great street photography, when you're in the zone, it's kind of like when you're walking down the street and you smell a bakery and all of a sudden something happens and then it's gone as soon as you walk away. And that's how street photography happens. It's like there'll be this beautiful moment or this interesting thing that happens. It's there for a minute and then it's out, and never
I think it takes
somebody
like Joel. I mean, he's a poet, really, in so many senses of the word, and to have that within you as part of your trait, as the way that you see the world, is obviously incredibly helpful when it comes to doing something like street photography. And obviously, there are other personality traits that lend themselves to other forms of photography as well, in terms of controlling mindsets or kind of attention to detail might mean you're going to be more suited to this type of genre of photography or that genre of photography.
Sure. I mean, some people are really great at architectural stuff. It doesn't move. Some people are great at street photography. It moves. Some people are great at still life. Some people are great at whatever it is, portraits. There's so many different things to explore, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about it is that it's so wide reaching.
Okay, so we've got the idea of the rules, kind of having them
go learn all the basic rules that people talk about, get those out of the way. Second of all is understanding relationships. I call it in the book, I talk about this, it's referred to as figure ground. So the ground is the composition, that's the frame of your image. Figures occur on the ground. So understanding figure ground relationships, understanding that when something is close to the edge, it's going to create tension in the image, and it's going to bring more attention to whatever is close to the edge. How images live and die on the edges. I mean, sometimes you see great photographs or great paintings, and they're not. That's the problem. They don't communicate with that frame as much. So that would be my second point, is to learn those. And then what would the third be? I think the third would be understanding context. Understanding, and what I mean by context, this can mean several different things. I think, you can have an image that could either work as I'm trying to think of an example. Let's just say, where's the image going to go? Because I will shoot this way too. If I know something is going to be used on Instagram, it's probably going to be portrait orientation. And because that's where it's going to go. But understand context outside of Instagram that you might be looking at. What if you wanted to do a book? What if you wanted to do an exhibition, whether it's at a coffee shop or whatever, wherever you're going to start with that? Start thinking about context, and then start thinking about how those pictures relate to one another, whether that's a series, whether that's, you could think of it in several different ways. Like, let's say the most obvious is, let's say I'm going to do a series of landscape from one particular place. I'm going to do a series of nudes. I'm going to do a series of botanical stuff. You could look at it that way. Or what if it's a geometric thing where you're exploring something that's happening in the composition, and the images could, this is what's interesting with a lot of, especially avant-garde photography from the 60s, is the image, what the image is, what the subject is almost inconsequential. I mean, it doesn't matter because there's a language that they're using to speak with that. Like Provoke is a great example of that, the Japanese zine that came out in the late 60s that Daido Moriyama did with several other photographers. But yeah, it's just, start thinking of your work and contextualizing it in those ways. I think is a third piece of advice. Then you're starting to say something, you're starting to create a body of work that does something. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good place.
It's a heavy number 3, because it takes a lot of. It does, and maybe a beginner photographer might pick something easy. Just say, I'm going to do a whole series of work. I'm going to do 20 images, a little portfolio on flowers. Something that it's easy. It's you can go to a botanical garden, you can go to the grocery store and bring them home. I mean, whatever. But just pick a subject and start to explore it, and then think of the work in context. How do those images start to relate? Like, if I put two side by side, do they work together? Or maybe swap that out and put this image in. Maybe that one works better. Or maybe how do they hang on a wall? That kind of thing. But start looking at it as a body of work. I think that can be interesting. And then move on to something different,
What is, if we were to kind of take it to current kind of state of photography, is there anything that's kind of particularly exciting at the moment when it comes to the current photography trends and practices? Is there anything that's, obviously we've touched on AI and what that means? But
yeah, we're at a real weird juncture, I think, because I think AI has represented a threat to so many photographers, and I think that's unfortunate. I don't care. I'm going to do what I do, no matter what AI does. But I also realize that with commercial photographers, they do start to feel threatened by that, and deservedly so. But in terms of trends of what we're seeing just in the art world, I still think that, probably my favorite photographer, just in terms of somebody who's still pushing the envelope, is Hiroshi Sugimoto. One of the finest photographers Japan has ever produced. He's a very interesting guy because he works in series work. He shoots large format film, the technical production in those images, but it's also, this is such a Japanese thing too. His skill set is so refined and his craft is so refined that you don't think about those things when you're looking at the image. It's not till later where you're realizing, man, those big prints are not easy to do. Or 8x10 is a pain in the butt to go shoot, seascapes with the same composition all over the world for 10 years at a time. But Sugimoto is even when he does things that I'm not sure I like, I still think about them, and sometimes I come back and decide, I do like that. Actually, he did a whole thing with Polaroids with the color, and he would use a prism to actually start to define what the color is of film, and that was something that was like. And then I thought about it later, and I'm like, that's so genius. I mean, and now I love it, right? Or the lightning fields, where it was like, especially when I first saw those, I wanted to see more seascapes. I wanted to see, more of the photograph stuff he did. And lightning fields is literally in the darkroom with a sheet of paper hitting. He had, what did they call it? The Van der Graaf generator. It's hitting paper with light. Sorry, with electronic static charge, and so it looks like lightning in the end. Yeah. And so you have all these prints of lightning. But he's such an interesting guy. He always does what you don't expect to see next. It's interesting because he has a background in architecture. He's trained as an architect, which is very unusual for somebody who's a photographer. He actually is a working architect too. I didn't realize this until recently. He has an architectural firm, and in Japan, you have to be licensed to be an architect. And he said that would take him another 10 years to study and go do it. So he hired 3 architects to do all the stuff that are licensed, and they do these amazing projects. So he works outside of photography as well. But I think that, there's so many things. You look at photography, we've talked a lot about social media, but I think even in the art world, you see a lot of trends that come and go. In the commercial world, you see it. You see stuff that's popular. You remember when the HDR thing was real big, I don't know, like 20 years ago, and everybody was shooting that. Yeah. And that's advice I would give to people too, is be real careful with the trends. They have shelf lives. They come and they go. And we were talking about that HDR thing, and when people were shooting like that, like they almost looked like paintings in a way, because the contrast was so torqued out, and the haze was abused.
Well, I think we're in the pro mist stage of trends, aren't we?
Yeah, we're definitely in the pro mist stage,
which is kind of quite retro in a way. It kind of reminds me of going back to the 80s and putting Vaseline on your lens a little bit, but not as extreme, but it's kind of delving in that same pool.
I mean, you look at the people who love to do film now, and a lot of lifted shadows and
pretty
you
flash.
see a lot of that too.
Yeah,
but all that stuff is that's the problem with the trend. You can crack the code and figure out how to do a trend, and you can participate, but it'll be over one day, and you haven't really accomplished much as a photographer doing that long term.
I think it's okay to follow a trend if you still got intention with your work, and you're still kind of really thinking about what you're producing, because ultimately, otherwise, it's just visual noise, right? And it won't have any staying power. But there will be images that follow a trend that will become iconic. And just because they follow the trend doesn't mean that they're weaker for it, 30 years from now.
Another part of that coin, though, the other side of that coin is that we are in a society that is post 1960s, right? And in the 1960s, we went from, where styles didn't change. You look at, like, you have to pull it back and look at the history of art, but people did the same kinds of things for long periods of times. And the 60s were all about the revolution and the explosion of that. And so literally everything that was abstract or weird or experimental probably was done in the 60s. And so we're in a time now after that where it maybe is a little harder to figure out what has not been done. I don't think we've done it all in photography yet. I think somebody's going to come along that's going to blow the lid off. Somebody's going to probably, I think Sugimoto is close. I think that somebody else will come along and they'll really do something different with it. And we'll know it when we see it,
It'll be an AI bot.
I hope not. I'll follow him on Instagram.
We'll be none the wiser.
Well, it's like we live in this grand human experiment right now. It's just so strange,
Yeah.
It honestly is so bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so weird. I think it'll be an interesting time to live through, because I think kids and grandkids will be like, what was it like? And you just be like, it's insane. It was genuinely a wild time to be alive.
Well, you remember when in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet was the hot buzz thing, and websites and the World Wide Web and all that. And before it settled down, everybody sat around and thought that we would be sitting around our underwear shopping, that real businesses wouldn't exist anymore. It would all be online. And
I mean, to be fair, you haven't seen what I'm actually wearing. shirt up top, but not much below.
but case in point, back in the late 90s, could we have envisioned doing something like this, where I've got two guys from the UK, I'm in Texas, and we're sitting here having this real-time discussion with 3 video feeds at one? I mean, you couldn't have imagined one.
No.
You know?
Honestly, it does still blow my mind that we're able to do this, because not only that, but there's other stuff going on, with all the clever stuff that I get access to on this system and things like that. Honestly, it blows my mind what we've now got at our fingertips. I had gigabit broadband installed at the house, and
Amazing.
that now, it used to take me 2 days to deliver on certain jobs, and now it takes 17 minutes. And that to me is, honestly.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Things have definitely changed.
I think the key. I was going to say the key in that though is so much that there is so much choice now. There's so much at our fingertips, and there is so much noise, and there is so much stuff going on that it's really important to kind of maintain your kind of personal waypoints, your own true north.
That's so true. And like my nephew is 22 now. And I still consider him to be pretty young. And he will talk sometimes, he'll ask me about what I do. And, when I started, like I kind of started at a point where you could finally afford a video camera. Like it used to be prohibitively expensive to go into video at all. Mm-hmm. We're all doing with, internet video now. But back then, postage stamp size video would require a $10,000 broadcast camera or something, And when I started my channel, the little toilet paper roll looking things came out, and they were $1,000 and under US. And so it changed the way I was able to do things. And I look at what my nephew has got in terms of, or his whole generation has in terms of the tools, the what is possible. And the thing is that the phone, right? Some of them do it, but a lot of them, they're so close to the forest they can't even see the trees on it. Like his sister, right. My niece, she's very embracing of what she can do. She loves to draw. It's all on the iPad. It's all, she loves the technology side of it. But the power that comes with that, it's I guess it's all relative. We dealt with what we had, and then this is what they have now. But you can be too close to the forest. See, it's in the camera industry too. Seriously, when Sony comes out with another camera that shoots 6,000 frames a second or whatever that is, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but
you're not far off. So
I'm in a position where I have stuff to review and all. And that's the hardest thing for me now. Is it's like this is so beyond what anybody even needs.
Well, we've chatted previously about this because I shoot on the R5Cs, right? Mm-hmm. And I was chatting with Greg, I was chatting with some friends of mine, and I'm kind of going, what exactly am I going to upgrade to? Like, it's going to have to be really knockout for me to just consider upgrading because I don't need more than I currently have. That literally does everything. But also the sheer cost of the units now.
It's insane. I know.
It's like $4,500. I remember when I was buying cameras and they were like 2,200, and I was like, whoa, that's crazy. And now it's like $4,500. And I'm like, UK, obviously not US. I would imagine it's way
expensive. It's even more expensive. It's like $6,000 US,
Yeah. But I feel like they're only going to get more expensive as people buy fewer of them, as people upgrade less.
Yeah.
So,
the funny thing, and I have to preface this by saying, your viewers are going to roll their eyes at this. This is the dumbest thing I could possibly say. But when I switched over when I bought my first Leica, the rangefinder, and this is the weird thing because that's an expensive camera. Mm-hmm. You can get the lenses used, you got to be patient, that kind of thing. But that was such a liberating experience, and I was also happy to have paid more for less, because the camera all of a sudden is a tool again. It's not a computer, and it's one thing I loved, and it kind of took me back to when I shot film all the time before I could afford a digital camera, and I would spend $200 on a camera on eBay, maybe.
Well, you are preaching to the choir. I've owned 2 Leicas. Greg currently owns 1?
2.
Right. I currently own only one that is a very expensive paperweight.
Yeah.
It fell in a lake.
Well, but it is a paperweight at this point.
Yeah, very sad.
And I don't know if you guys felt that way too, but there was something about it for me that first of all, I don't like that it's the only rangefinder game in town, because it is. There's Pixie now, but if you want to go with the real deal, it's a Leica. Nikon doesn't make one. So the rangefinder experience alone is kind of it's very liberating for me because I can see outside the frame, and that helps considerably as a photographer. The other thing is manual focus on those lenses. You realize, and this is look, Sony, Canon, Nikon, they've all done amazing things with autofocus, but I'm sorry, how hard is it to turn a tube? It's not hard to, for some people, might be visual problems or something like that. It could be a great assistance. But the problem I have with autofocus, even as good as it is now, is I select the focus point, not the camera. And because sometimes I don't want it where you think it's going to be,
Sure. So on the flip side, as a commercial portrait guy, the autofocus has been an absolute godsend for me because that is simply one thing I now don't need to worry about.
Yeah, you got it on the eye and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. Like whatever eye is closest to the camera, and that I was joking with a digi before Christmas, and we were saying that it used to be not on my shoots, but there used to be kind of like a 50% hit rate for some of his other guys that he digied with.
Sure.
And now you're lucky if you get like 1 or 2 frames that are out for a whole shoot. So that for me and for commercial guys is a dream. But I totally get what you're saying. Right?
I think like so much of it comes down to getting that simplicity back that we've lost with all the kind of bells and whistles.
Absolutely.
It becomes a bit of a distraction if you've. The thing about, I think, the appeal for shooting on film for so many people is the fact that you do have 36 shots or 12 shots or whatever format you're shooting on, and it's the tyranny of choice with digital now. If you are getting that many frames from a shoot, there's so much choice that the final kind of decision becomes, I don't know, it's harder to pin down, and over a career, it's like, well, how do you? It then becomes harder to find a consistency in your work in terms of like, this is what really shone through because there's so much choice.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that one of the things I just dislike the most is I've gone on press trips for sports lenses, Sony cameras, Canon. I did theirs last summer, and you're supposed to be testing the 30 frames a second, the 60 frames a second, so on and so forth. And I'll do it, and then I come back and I've got thousands of images that were all done in 30 minutes. And you've got to go through them. It is the biggest. It's just such a chore. And what's interesting is to pull this back. William Eggleston has this great quote, and I don't know if it's true or not because sometimes I think Eggleston had his Southern shtick worked up, but brilliant. One of my favorite photographers in the history of photography. He had such a unique style and look. And a lot of times, and I think his is a great example of abstraction. You'll look at a picture, and at first glance, it's a picture of a parking lot with a piece of trash in it, and you're like, really? But then you see how the colors work together, and then you realize that the picture transcends what it's actually of, and then you start to see something else. But Eggleston has this great quote where he said that his one rule as a photographer is he would make one shot and move on. The reason is if he took 2 shots of the same thing, it was too confusing to figure out later which slide he wanted, from the first. So that was his thing, is he would take one, he move on to the next. And that's such a great discipline if it in fact is accurate.
I was going to say, show us your contact sheets, Eggleston.
Yeah, right.
Sure.
Proof where it didn't happen.
But even if it's not realistic, it's such a great goal to strive for. Yeah, but the other part of that too that I've seen with people is when they shoot in such volume like that is then they become really proud with the number, and they like to tell people, I shot 7 million shots last year, and really, how many of them were would you print and show me right now? Well, and then that's something that I've seen it with students, even when I've done workshops, is people who end up shooting a lot, then they get really proud of the fact that they've got a terabyte of images on the trip. And it's like, don't be proud of that. Be proud of the images you've got on the trip, even if it's 2 or 1.
Well, that's it. Now, when I come back from a job, I'm like, cool. I shot 250 shots. Yeah. Smash that, because if I shot that a year ago, it would have been 700. Yeah. And I'm now trying to shoot.
You're
less
proud of the lower number.
Yeah, exactly. I want to try and get it as close to 36 as I can.
Hey, you know what? That should be the goal. 36.
But honestly, it's the more images I shoot, the more and more cross and frustrated I'm getting with myself in the process.
Yes.
Because it's all the other stuff that comes with it. It's the extra time when I have to edit them up for the proof sheet, and I have to then send the files, and then I have to go through and make the selections, or kind of, make my refined cut down for the client. And then you're spending an extra hour on it because, there's 8 frames that all look the same. Then you've got them in the grid in Capture One. You're going, I don't know which one. And so actually, as if I can get that number down and down and down, and I love the idea of just shooting one thing one time. I think it's great.
I've never done it, and so maybe I should do it later today or something. But the whole idea, the Eggleston thing, just try and go for a walk and do one shot of no more than one. Move on. See if you can do it.
I quite like that is a fantastic book from Magnum, the contact sheets book, which is fascinating to see the contact sheets of photographers and the way that they would build up to, your decisive moment. And see kind of the moments before that didn't quite work, and then the moments afterwards when it's disappeared, and it's that beautiful kind of like coming together in that split second of time, that magical moment. And I quite enjoy looking at them to understand how photographers are thinking and working. But at the same time, I think like what you're saying about kind of having one shot, there is, art is about scarcity so much as well. Like the rarity of something is partly what makes it beautiful, because it is unique and it's the only one in the world. Whereas if you have 50 variations of that, it becomes less special. Sure.
And we are looking at process at that point, which is not meant to be seen necessarily. And I'm with you. I love that book, the Magnum Context, because it is, as a student of photography, it's very revealing and in many ways. I think one, it makes you feel a little bit better that it takes you a while to get to a shot sometimes, and two, it's like you can start to see the process of what somebody else went through. But it's I remember Sam Abel, who is a former National Geographic photographer. He has a whole thing that he teaches on that too, where he shows some behind the scenes shots on stuff, and he would change the angle up and all. And it is important to work like that, because you're trying to get something, and if you have the time and there's two sides of looking at it. Is it from the learning side as a student, or is it from the professional side? Because like Tom, if you're shooting a portrait session, I don't think that your clients are going to appreciate it if there's a ton of experimentation involved. Like they expect you to be kind of ready.
They want the result. But what I do is I get the result really quickly, and I'm like, can we riff with this? And a lot of them are like, absolutely, yeah, cool. What do you want to do? And I'm like, I've had this great idea. Let's try this. Yeah. And so so that's how I normally do it. I get the result first, make sure everything's ticked off, the brief's completed, and then try and experiment.
So you'll have to forgive me because I can't remember the person's name, but I had an individual, this guy who was in the UK actually, who sent me a zine recently. And they were really wild portraits that were all done with like a 14 millimeter. I mean, just crazy wide angle. And I first looked at it and I thought, what on earth? This like gets old after a while because it's all cartoony, with the distortion, the way it sets out. But then I read the note that he sent to me and all, and it was a little zine that he'd made, and he's a professional photographer. He shoots portraits and does sitters and stuff. And one of his little things is he'll riff with people at the end of a session, and he always does it with a piece of equipment that's just kind of unconventional. And so in this case, it was this ultra wide angle lens. And he said, and I think he succeeded on this, because all of a sudden you're seeing, like he said, it's very hard with the lens that wide and you're in a small studio, like your light stands and stuff, the things you would never have in an image start creeping in. Then you realize that those are interesting in a certain context, but it's removed from the work. And he always asks the person, "Hey, we got a couple extra minutes. Can I do this thing with you? Like, I'm shooting with this crazy lens," and generally they're open to it. And sometimes you get really interesting results out of that. But that's that. And then that's a playfulness that I think is important to photography, that I think people have to, I think it's our responsibility to do some of that, like what you're doing, just riffing around and trying to figure it out.
It's experimentation.
That's how we improve.
Yeah. I think I try and do it with a wide lux on a lot of assignments. So I have an old F7, and I used to always travel with that camera because, eventually, I've been shooting 20 years, maybe in another 20 years, there'll be enough images to make a small little project out of,
Sure.
It's
you never
just,
know.
you've got to be constantly experimenting with these things.
Let's see what you guys are talking about, and this is what I love is the difference. There's I don't know if you guys have seen it. Came out last year, I think. Rick Rubin has a book on creativity, and Rick Rubin being a music producer who's worked with tons of bands and all. And one of the wonderful things that he explores in there is the idea and the difference between an artist and an artisan. And in an artisan, let's say you're into carpentry or whatever that is. Being an artisan requires that you have a technical skill that you build up to do things a specific way all the time. The difference is an artist has to go beyond that and push that envelope into new creative territory. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. And that's an important thing for any photographer to be doing. If you're not doing it, you're just being the artisan, which is fine. But if you're looking for improvement in your work or variety or something new or different, you're just not going to find it unless you do things like that,
That's a great takeaway. That has been on my reading list actually for a while. So that's
highly recommend. The problem with that book though, it's so good and everything is like little zingers and it's so zen and it's like you'll read and I've got to stop and internalize what I've just read. And if you get the audio version, it's got like little like Buddhist gongs on it and stuff.
Does it actually? That's amazing.
It's funny, yeah. But it's very difficult to get through just because it's so condensed and I mean that as a compliment. It's just really good. Highly recommended though. Easy to read too.
Well, we will link to that in our show notes as well. Listen, we've kept you so far for an hour, so I think we need to move on to our final two questions, which we always have for guests, which are, I mean, these are not going to be particularly easy for you, especially the first one, which, well, actually, we'll start with your desert island camera, which I'm guessing, I think I know what you're going to say, but I might be totally wrong. So
I think you think I'm going to say the Holga.
Oh, no, I thought that Greg was thinking that you might say the Leica.
I was thinking like M6 or something like that. Or
Oh, well, okay. So favorite camera of all time and desert island camera might be two different things. I mean, I don't know. I just love the rangefinder. And if I could only shoot one for the rest of my career, I mean, I'd be happy to any of the recent M's, the M11, the M10, those are all fan. And I could do it. And the desert island lens would be the Simlex 50. I'm fine,
Right.
It's interesting because originally I was thinking about this. Spoiler alert, they told me they were going to ask this when we started. The Nikon F3 is probably one of my favorite cameras ever because the form factor and the size and the way it works, it's so simple.
Yeah.
I always love that camera. And the Holga I've talked about a lot. Sorry, I'm giving you three cameras on my channel because the Holga has one shutter speed, one aperture, it's and one ISO. So you've got to figure out what you're going to do.
I have one up there that I haven't used for, probably about 8 years. But I used to quite enjoy doing the old Holga panoramic where you kind of wind the film on a certain amount of clicks and you end up with your, crossing over your negs.
The first time I ever did that, I did it backwards. And so I had all these weird, and then I thought, hey, what a cool technique, and kept doing it. So
yeah, it's a great camera in the sense of its simplicity. And I think to talk about what we were talking about earlier with all this kind of the digitization of what we do in the computer, right? Is this the correct term? The kind of computerization of it all is the fact that you lose that sense of magic of the fact that a camera essentially is a box with a hole in it that has a medium that captures light, right? And that, and the magic of that in itself, the purity and the simplicity of that, of the fact that it then becomes a time machine, is what really is, for me, kind of like the essence of photography and why it's so exciting.
I agree totally. I think the other side of that too is that's so important is because you have no options. You've got to figure out how to make it work. And I remember I had a Holga that had a bulb modification, and so that was my two choices. I could do one shutter speed or bulb, and you rig it up on a tripod and figure out how to shoot things that are unusual. But you've got to stay at the same ISO, and those restrictions end up giving a lot of creative advice to people on how to work around them. You don't get them in digital at all. You'll never.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Okay, and your desert island photo book then, what would that be?
Desert island photo book. I would say, we already talked about Magnum contact sheets. That's a good one, but I don't know if I'd want that on a desert island because I think I'd exhaust it at some point. There is a book that, and this is going to be an oddball choice, but it's one that I love. John Blakemore has a book called Black and White Photography Workshop. And John Blakemore is an incredible photographer for one, but this was his approach to black and white. And with Ansel Adams, we always had the zone system, which is essentially how to show you how to get even contrast on no grade paper, right? Because that's what he was dealing with when they were shooting that. And the whole idea is that you can have, zone 10 is pure white and zone 1 is pure black, right? And you're going to have detail at between 3 and 7. Blakemore took that and spun it around, and it's how he shoots. And it says, okay, what if we have no blacks in the image and everything is zone 6, 7, and above? It's just bright tones. And so you end up with this beautiful high key image of like he would shoot tulips and stuff. Or what if you spun it the other way and we have these low key images that don't have anything brighter than zone 3? So it's a real dark image, but you're dealing with all the detail and it blew my mind because all of a sudden here's a guy telling you to break all the rules in a very specific way. And that inspired me on so many levels. I don't print in the darkroom anymore. I did at the time. That's why I read the book. But because it changed my approach when I was doing printing so much, but zone system, it's how you develop the film. And also he would take you all the way back and say, okay, if you're going to put your light meter here and you're going to do this, and here's how you're going to add up to. But the reason it's a Desert Island book is because of the inspiration of something that is fairly conventionally taught that he spun around and started showing you how to do it unconventionally. And that's something you rarely see in books too, is how to break the rules, in a way that is intelligent and purposeful and has a result to it. And so I think I would hang on to that book just to reread it for inspiration on that level.
That's
nice.
A good answer. That is
Love
a very
that.
good answer. Well, listen, Ted, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
If people want to find out more, obviously they should head to your YouTube channel, which can you just give us where all the socials are and the where they can find the book as well?
Yeah, you can. If you go to tedforbes.com, you find everything. So the book's there, the YouTube channel is linked there. That's probably the central point. The book, I think it releases in the UK on January 30th. I don't know why the release dates are different between countries, but they are apparently.
Oh.
Yeah, so it came out here on the 17th of December. We did sell out, what I mean by sold out is...
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. What that means, though, is that the publisher doesn't have any more. They're having to print more. So we sold out of the initial 2,500. So you can still find it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever your bookstore of choice is. But just know that once they're out, they won't be able to get more. So
okay.
Until the sort of sold out. I wish I could say it's completely sold out, but they are reprinting more. And the last I heard was March or April. So, but yeah, the UK, I think Amazon there should have plenty of copies if you're in the UK and you want a copy and all that. So
fantastic.
Perfect.
Well, we
Lovely
will
stuff.
put a link to the book and a link to everything else in the show notes as ever. So Ted, thank you so much for your time today. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. This was fun. I really enjoyed the conversation. So we'll do it again sometime.
Likewise.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you later.
See you.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you'd like to find out more, you can find us on YouTube, which is www.youtube.com/@exposednegative. And if you'd like to follow us personally, you can find us both on Instagram. Myself, I'm at Greg Fennell, which is GregFunnell. And Tom can be found at tombarnes.com, which is TomBarnesDotcom. Thank you very much.